The ring that changed everything wasn't supposed to be there, not on the finger of a man who had destroyed her family. Emily Carter's hands trembled as she adjusted the IV drip for the third time in 10 minutes. The fluorescent lights of New York Presbyterian's emergency wing casting harsh shadows across her exhausted face. 29 years old, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of too many double shifts and too little sleep, she moved through the sterile corridors like a ghost, invisible, forgettable. Just another nurse in scrubs, drowning in student loan debt and the weight of a life that felt smaller each day. The familiar ache settled in her chest as she watched wealthy patients demand private rooms and bark orders at staff, their entitlement filling the air like expensive perfume. She'd learned early in her career to blend into the background, to anticipate needs without drawing attention. In their world, she was furniture, useful when required, ignored otherwise. But tonight felt different. The storm outside had knocked out power in 3 districts, flooding the ER with emergencies. Emily's supervisor, Margaret, had called in every available nurse, her voice tight with stress over the phone. "We need you, Em. I know you just finished a 12-hour shift, but—" "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Emily had interrupted, already reaching for her keys. She couldn't afford to say no, not with rent due, and her credit card maxed out from her grandmother's funeral expenses 6 months ago. As she restocked the crash cart with trembling fingers, Emily's mind drifted to the tiny studio apartment waiting for her, cold, empty, and filled with unpaid bills. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "Mina querida Emily, remember who you are. The women in our family, we are stronger than we know." But Emily didn't feel strong. She felt invisible, worthless, forgotten. The automatic doors burst open with a rush of cold air and chaos. Paramedics wheeled in a stretcher, their voices urgent and professional. 62-year-old male, chest pains, possible cardiac event. Blood pressure dropping fast. Emily snapped into action, her training overriding her exhaustion. She grabbed the defibrillator and followed the stretcher into Trauma Bay 3, where Dr. Martinez was already pulling on gloves. The patient thrashed weakly on the gurney, his expensive suit torn and mud-stained from the storm. "Get him stabilized," Dr. Martinez ordered, his hands flying over the monitors. "Emily, prep the EKG leads." As Emily reached for the patient's wrist to attach the monitors, something caught the harsh fluorescent light and sent prisms of blue across the white sheets. There on his ring finger was an antique gold band with a deep sapphire stone, weathered, familiar, impossible. The world tilted. Emily's breath caught in her throat, her hands freezing mid-motion. The ring was exactly as she remembered. The delicate filigree work around the stone, the tiny chip on the left side, the way the gold had worn thin near the band. She'd traced those details 1,000 times as a child, sitting in her grandmother's lap, while stories of their family's history in Portugal filled the small kitchen with warmth. "Nurse Carter," Dr. Martinez's voice seemed to come from underwater. "The leads?" Emily's vision blurred. That ring had vanished the night her grandmother was evicted from her home 15 years ago. The night everything changed. The night Emily's family lost not just their house, but the last connection to their heritage, their dignity, their hope. Her hands shook violently as she stared at the unconscious man on the table. Even in his weakened state, she recognized the sharp features, the silver hair, the cruel mouth that had appeared in newspapers for decades. Richard Hamilton, real estate mogul, hospital board member, the man whose company had systematically bought and demolished half of her old neighborhood, the man who wore her grandmother's ring. "Emily," Dr. Martinez snapped. "What's wrong with you?" The words tumbled out before she could stop them, her voice cracking with 15 years of buried grief. That ring was my grandmother's." Richard Hamilton's eyes flew open at her voice. For a moment, he stared at her with confusion. Then recognition flickered across his pale features. His gaze dropped to the ring on his finger, and Emily watched the color drain from his face completely. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the beeping monitors. "No, it can't be." And then his eyes rolled back, and the heart monitor screamed its flatline warning, plunging the trauma bay into chaos. The code blue alarm pierced the air like a battle cry as Emily stood frozen, watching the medical team fight to save the life of the man who had destroyed her family. "Get the crash cart," Dr. Martinez shouted, his hands already positioned for chest compressions. "Emily, I need you focused." Whatever just happened, push it aside. But Emily couldn't push it aside. As she mechanically handled instruments and adjusted machines, her mind raced back 15 years to that terrible night. She'd been 14, hiding behind her bedroom door as her grandmother sobbed in the kitchen, clutching a stack of legal papers. The Hamilton Development Corporation had found a loophole in the property taxes, forcing immediate payment of fees that had somehow multiplied overnight. They want $50,000. Minha filha, her grandmother had whispered to Emily's mother. Where am I supposed to find $50,000? Within a month, the house was gone. Grandma Rosa had been forced into a terrible nursing facility, her health failing rapidly without the garden she'd tended for 40 years, without the familiar walls that held her memories. She'd died 6 months later, calling for Emily in Portuguese, reaching for granddaughter's hand with fingers that no longer wore the family ring. The ring? Emily? She'd gasped during one of her lucid moments. I had to. I'm sorry, minha querida. I'm so sorry. Emily had assumed it was buried with her grandmother or sold to pay medical bills. She'd never imagined it could end up on the finger of the man who had taken everything from them. We've got him back, Dr. Martinez announced, wiping sweat from his forehead as Richard Hamilton's heartbeat steadied on the monitor. Get him up to the cardiac unit. He's stable but needs constant monitoring. As the team prepared for transport, Emily found herself alone with the unconscious billionaire for a brief moment. His breathing was shallow but steady, his face gray with exhaustion. Up close, she could see the fine craftsmanship of the ring more clearly. The Portuguese hallmarks her grandmother had explained. The tiny inscription inside the band that read, "Para sempre, meu amor," forever, my love. The words her grandfather had engraved before he shipped out to World War II, never to return. Em? A gentle voice interrupted her thoughts. Sarah Chen, her closest friend among the nursing staff, appeared at her elbow. You look like you've seen a ghost. What happened in here? Emily's throat felt raw. That ring he's wearing, it belonged to my grandmother. I know it sounds crazy, but Emily, Sarah's expression grew concerned. Are you sure? I mean, it's just a ring. There could be a dozen like it. There's only one like it, Emily whispered fiercely. My grandfather had it made in Portugal in 1943. Look at the inscription, Para sempre, meu amor. Look at the chip on the left side from when Grandma dropped it in the kitchen sink. Look at how the gold is worn thin where she twisted it when she was nervous. Sarah peered closer, her eyebrows rising. Oh my God, Em, you're right. But how did this guy get it? Before Emily could answer, Margaret appeared in the doorway, her supervisor's expression harried from managing the crisis. Carter, Chen, I need you both in the cardiac unit. Mr. Hamilton specifically requested a private room and our best nursing staff. He asked for me. Emily's voice came out as barely a whisper. Actually, he asked for the nurse with the kind eyes who recognized the ring. Margaret's tone was puzzled. Do you know what that means? Emily's hands clenched into fists. Kind eyes. As if kindness could erase what he'd done. As if a compliment could smooth over 15 years of poverty, struggle and loss. I'll take the assignment, she heard herself saying. Sarah grabbed her arm. Are you sure? If this is too personal, I need to know the truth, Emily said, her voice growing stronger. I need to know how he got that ring and why he's wearing it. As they walked toward the elevator, Sarah squeezed her hand. Whatever you find out, I've got your back. We've been friends since nursing school and I know you. You don't make mistakes about things that matter. The elevator doors opened to reveal the hospital's cardiac wing. Quieter, more luxurious than the emergency department, with private rooms and expensive artwork designed to soothe wealthy patients. Emily had worked up here before but always felt out of place among the marble floors and crystal chandeliers. Room 314, Margaret said, handing Emily the chart. He's requested minimal staff interaction, but his vitals need checking every hour. And Emily? Her supervisor's voice softened slightly. Whatever history you might have with this patient, remember your professional obligations. We can't afford complaints from the Hamilton family. The Hamilton family. Emily had forgotten that Richard wasn't just wealthy. He was connected to the hospital's board of directors, to political figures, to a network of power that could crush her career with a single phone call. But as she stood outside room 314, holding the chart with shaking hands, Emily realized she was past caring about consequences. For 15 years, she'd been invisible, powerless, afraid to speak up or fight back. She'd watched her family fall apart, while men like Richard Hamilton built empires on the foundations of other people's, dreams. The ring on his finger had been her grandmother's final connection to a love story that began in wartime Portugal. It represented sacrifice, hope, and the strength of women who had survived poverty and loss with their dignity intact. And somehow, it had ended up in the hands of the man who had stolen everything else. Emily took a deep breath, pushed open the door to room 314, and stepped into the lion's den. Richard Hamilton was awake and waiting for her. He sat propped against expensive pillows, his hospital gown a stark contrast to the gold watch that still gleamed on his left wrist and the antique ring that caught the lamplight on his right hand. His eyes, sharp blue and calculating even in his weakened state, tracked Emily's movement as she entered the private room. The space felt more like a hotel suite than a hospital room, with mahogany furniture, silk curtains, and a view of Central Park that probably cost more per night than Emily made in a month. Fresh flowers filled crystal vases, their perfume masking the usual antiseptic smell. "Miss Carter," Richard's voice was hoarse but controlled. "Please close the door." Emily's training warred with her instincts. Every protocol said to leave the door open during patient care, but the weight of his stare and the glint of that familiar ring made her comply. The soft click of the latch sounded unnaturally loud in the hushed room. "Your grandmother," he said without preamble, "was Rosa Santos." The chart slipped from Emily's numb fingers, clattering to the marble floor. "How do you—" She lived at 47 Cherry Street in the Lower East Side. Small yellow house with a garden full of roses and herbs. She made the best linguiça and sweetbread in the neighborhood. Richard's eyes never left Emily's face. "She called you Minha Querida Emily and told everyone you were going to be a doctor someday." Emily's legs trembled. She gripped the foot of the hospital bed to steady herself. "Stop, just stop talking. She taught you Portuguese lullabies and showed you how to tend roses. You helped her make soup for the church every Sunday, and she always saved the biggest portion for Mrs. Chen next door, who was too proud to ask for help." "Stop," Emily's voice cracked. Tears burned her eyes as memories flooded back. The warm kitchen, her grandmother's gentle hands, the safety of being completely loved. "How dare you talk about her like you knew her? Like you cared?" Richard's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Because I did know her, Emily, and I did care." The words hit Emily like a physical blow. "You're lying. You destroyed her life. Your company, Hamilton Development, they took her house, forced her into that horrible nursing home where she died alone and forgotten. I never authorized the acquisition of Cherry Street properties." His voice was quiet, steady. "That was my son, Marcus. He was aggressive in his business practices." "Your son?" Emily laughed bitterly. "So you hide behind your child while you count the money?" Richard's jaw tightened. "Marcus made many decisions without my knowledge during the years I was distracted by personal losses. By the time I discovered what had happened to your grandmother, it was too late." "Too late for what?" Emily stepped closer, her fear transforming into fury. "Too late to give her back her home? Too late to save her from dying in a place that smelled like disinfectant and despair? Too late to—" Her voice broke. "Too late to let her keep her dignity?" Richard lifted his right hand slowly, the ring catching the light. Emily's breath stopped as she watched him twist it, the same nervous gesture her grandmother had made thousands of times. "She gave this to me," he said quietly, "the night before she died." Emily's world tilted. "That's impossible. She was in Sunset Manor on the Upper West Side. I'd been visiting her for 3 months, bringing flowers, reading to her when the nurses were too busy. She remembered me from before." Richard's voice grew softer. "She told me about a granddaughter named Emily, who was studying to be a nurse, who had her great-grandmother's eyes and her great-grandfather's stubborn streak." "You're lying." But even as Emily said it, doubt crept into her voice. Sunset Manor. That wasn't where her grandmother had died. Emily had visited her at Riverside Care, a state facility with peeling paint and overworked staff. "She said the ring should go to Emily when the time was right," Richard continued. "When Emily was strong enough to know the truth about what really happened to her family." Emily sank into the visitor's chair, her legs no longer able to support her. "What truth?" Richard was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. "Your grandmother didn't lose her house because of taxes, Emily. She signed it over voluntarily. That's a lie. But Emily's voice lacked conviction. Fragments of overheard conversations began piecing themselves together. Hushed phone calls. Her grandmother's insistence that Emily and her mother not visit during those final months. The way Grandma Rosa had seemed almost relieved when she spoke about leaving the house behind. She was protecting someone, Richard said gently. Someone she loved more than property, more than pride, more than her own comfort. The heart monitor's steady beeping filled the silence as Emily stared at this man who claimed to know secrets about her family that she'd never been told. The ring seemed to pulse with its own light, hypnotic and familiar. If any of this is true, Emily whispered, then why didn't she tell me? Why did she let me think? Because she knew you'd try to save her, and she couldn't let you sacrifice your future for her past. Richard's voice was heavy with something that might have been grief. She made me promise to find you someday, to give you the ring, and to tell you that her love was stronger than any building, any deed, any amount of money. Emily's hands shook as she reached toward the ring, then pulled back. I don't believe you. This is some kind of sick game. Richard slowly, carefully began to slide the ring from his finger. Then take it, Emily. Take what's rightfully yours, and decide for yourself what the truth is worth. The ring sat in his palm like a small, perfect weight, the last piece of her grandmother's story, waiting to be claimed. Emily stared at the ring in Richard's palm, her whole body trembling with the weight of possibility and fear. I can't, she whispered, pulling her hands back as if the ring might burn her. If I take it, if I believe you, everything I thought I knew about my family, about what happened to Grandma Rosa, would change, Richard finished quietly. And change is terrifying, even when it brings truth. The door burst open suddenly, making both Emily and Richard jump. Dr. Marcus Hamilton strode in, tall, sharp-featured, and radiating the kind of aggressive confidence that Emily had learned to recognize in wealthy hospital visitors. His expensive suit was perfectly tailored, his silver hair swept back, and his cold eyes immediately assessed the scene with predatory calculation. Father. His voice carried both concern and irritation. The nurses said you were having chest pains. I came as soon as I heard. His gaze shifted to Emily, dismissive and quick. You can go now, nurse. I need to speak with my father privately. Emily started to rise, her training automatically deferring to authority, but Richard's voice stopped her. Emily stays. Richard's tone carried a strength that seemed to surprise his son. We were having an important conversation. Marcus's eyes narrowed as he noticed the ring still gleaming in his father's palm. What's this about, Dad? You're supposed to be resting, not playing with jewelry and chatting with the help. The casual cruelty of the help hit Emily like a slap. She'd heard variations of that phrase her entire nursing career, but tonight it felt different. Tonight she was holding pieces of her grandmother's story, and she refused to be dismissed. I'm Emily Carter, she said, standing straighter. Rosa Santos was my grandmother. Marcus went very still. The color drained from his face as his gaze darted between Emily and his father. That's not possible. Rosa Santos died years ago. She was just some old woman who couldn't pay her property taxes. Just some old woman. Emily's voice rose. She was a human being with a family, with dreams, with a right to die in her own home surrounded by people who loved her. Emily, Richard warned softly, but 15 years of buried rage was spilling out of her now. No, let me finish. Your son talks about my grandmother like she was nothing, like her life didn't matter. Do you know what it's like to watch someone you love lose everything? To see them shrivel up and die in a place where no one knows their name or cares about their stories? Marcus's jaw tightened. Business is business. We gave her fair market value for the property. If she couldn't afford to maintain it, that's not Hamilton Development's fault. Fair market value. Emily laughed bitterly. You gave her 3 days to come up with $50,000 in fabricated taxes and fees. 3 days to pack up 40 years of memories and find somewhere else to live. The taxes were legitimate, Marcus shot back, but something flickered in his eyes. We followed all legal procedures. Legal doesn't mean right, Emily said, her voice steady now with conviction. And it doesn't mean honest. Richard was watching his son with an expression Emily couldn't read. Marcus, sit down. There are things we need to discuss. I don't have time for this, Dad. The board meeting is tomorrow morning and I need to know you're well enough to attend. Hamilton Development is announcing The Cherry Street Luxury Complex project. It's going to be our biggest development yet. Cherry Street, Emily breathed. You're building on my grandmother's land. Among others, Marcus said dismissively. It's prime real estate now that the neighborhood has been upgraded. Emily felt something break inside her chest, not from pain this time, but from a fury so pure it felt like power. Upgraded? You mean after you forced out all the families who built that community, who made it beautiful with their gardens and their stories and their love? I made it profitable, Marcus snapped. Those old houses were falling apart. The residents couldn't maintain them properly. We improved the area. You destroyed it, Emily said, her voice carrying a strength she'd never heard before. You took a place where children played in the streets and grandmothers shared recipes over garden fences, and you turned it into, what? Another row of glass towers where no one knows their neighbors' names? Richard was still holding the ring, but his eyes were fixed on his son with an intensity that made Marcus shift uncomfortably. Marcus, how exactly did we acquire the Santos property? The usual way. Legal notices, tax assessments, standard procedures. Show me the paperwork. What? Marcus looked confused. Dad, you approved all those acquisitions yourself. No, Richard said quietly. I was dealing with your mother's illness that year. I signed papers you put in front of me, but I never reviewed the details. Show me the Rosa Santos file. Something dangerous flickered across Marcus's face. That's ancient history. The development is moving forward. We've already broken ground. Emily watched the exchange, understanding dawning. He's lying, she said suddenly. You can see it in his face. Whatever he did to my grandmother, he's hiding it from you too. Marcus turned on her, his mask of politeness completely gone. You need to know your place, nurse. This is family business and you're nobody. A nobody from nowhere who should be grateful she even has a job in a hospital like this. The words hung in the air like poison. Emily felt the familiar shame trying to creep back. The voice that had whispered for years that she was invisible, worthless, forgettable. But then she looked at the ring in Richard's hand, her grandmother's ring, the symbol of a love that had survived war, poverty, and loss. She thought of Rosa Santos, who had saved every penny to help Emily through nursing school, who had taught her that dignity came from within, not from what others thought of you. My place, Emily said, her voice steady and clear, is wherever I choose to stand. And she was just getting started. The tension in the room was suffocating as Emily faced Marcus Hamilton, her heart pounding with a courage she'd never known she possessed. You want to know about your place? Marcus stepped closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Your place is changing bedpans and following orders. Your place is being invisible until someone needs something cleaned up or thrown away. Marcus, Richard's voice cut through the room like a blade. That's enough. But Marcus was past listening. Years of unchecked power and entitlement poured out of him as he glared at Emily. Do you really think you can waltz in here and make accusations? Do you have any idea who you're talking to? I could have you fired with a single phone call. I could make sure you never work in healthcare again. Emily felt the old fear trying to take hold, the terror of losing her job, her apartment, her carefully constructed life. But something else was rising inside her. Something her grandmother had planted long ago with Portuguese lullabies and stories of brave women who had survived worse than Marcus Hamilton. Go ahead, she said quietly. Make your phone call. Marcus blinked, clearly not expecting that response. What? Fire me. Blacklist me. Use all your power and connections to destroy my career. Emily's voice grew stronger with each word. But it won't change the truth about what you did to my grandmother, and it won't make you any less of a coward for hiding behind Daddy's money. You little... Marcus. Richard struggled to sit up straighter, his face pale but his eyes blazing. Sit down now. For a moment, father and son stared at each other in a battle of wills that had probably been brewing for years. Finally, Marcus sank into the leather armchair, his jaw clenched with resentment. Richard turned to Emily, the ring still warm in his palm. I need you to tell me everything you remember about your grandmother's final months. Every detail, no matter how small. Emily's mind raced back to that terrible time. She stopped letting us visit her. Said the facility had strict rules about visiting hours. But when we called, they said we could come any time. She seemed scared, like she was protecting us from something. Or someone, Richard said grimly, his eyes never leaving his son's face. She started talking about the past more, about Portugal and the old stories. She kept saying she had to make things right before she died. Emily's voice caught. I thought she was just getting confused, but now you think she knew something, Richard finished. Marcus shifted in his chair, his knuckles white where he gripped the armrests. This is ridiculous. You're both building some conspiracy theory out of an old woman's dementia. Grandma Rosa didn't have dementia, Emily said fiercely. Her mind was sharp right until the end. She just gave up, like something broke inside her. Richard closed his eyes briefly, pain crossing his features. She asked me to promise her something that last night. She made me swear I'd find out what really happened to her house, to her neighbors. She said there were others, families who'd been forced out through falsified documents and illegal fees. That's absurd, Marcus snapped, but sweat was beading on his forehead. Is it? Richard's voice was quiet but deadly. Because I'm starting to remember things, Marcus. Papers you brought to me during your mother's chemotherapy treatments. Documents you said were routine acquisitions that needed my signature. I was so focused on caring for her that I signed whatever you put in front of me. Emily watched Marcus's face change, saw the moment when arrogance gave way to something that looked like panic. Dad, you're not thinking clearly. The medication, the stress, my thinking is perfectly clear. Richard held up the ring, letting it catch the light. Rosa Santos gave me this ring because she believed in justice, even when she couldn't find it for herself. She trusted me to discover the truth. The truth. Marcus laughed, but it sounded forced. The truth is that woman couldn't pay her taxes. The truth is that sometimes business requires difficult decisions. Then you won't mind if we review those decisions, Richard said calmly. Emily, I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. 3 months ago, I hired a private investigator to look into Hamilton Development's acquisition practices. What he found, Richard's voice hardened. What he found was systematic fraud. The room went completely silent, except for the steady beeping of monitors. Emily felt her world tilting again, but this time towards something that might be hope. Falsified tax assessments, Richard continued, his eyes locked on Marcus. Fabricated liens. Bribery of city officials to fast-track eviction proceedings. And at the center of it all, my son's signature on documents that stole homes from families who'd lived in them for generations. Marcus shot to his feet, his face flushed with rage. You can't prove any of that. Actually, I can. Richard reached into the bedside table and pulled out a thick manila folder. Bank records, forged documents, witness statements. Your grandmother wasn't the only victim, Emily. There were 17 families on Cherry Street alone. Emily's knees gave out, and she sank back into the chair. 17 families, 17 stories of loss and heartbreak. Also, Marcus Hamilton could build his luxury towers. The investigator also found something else, Richard said softly, his gaze shifting to Emily. Your grandmother didn't just give me this ring. Emily, she also gave me these. He opened the folder and pulled out a small stack of photographs, pictures of a young Emily at various nursing school events, graduation photos, newspaper clippings about nursing scholarships she'd received. Her grandmother had been following her life, collecting proof of her granddaughter's success. She was so proud of you, Richard whispered. She showed me every picture, told me about every achievement. She said you were going to be the kind of nurse who fought for people who couldn't fight for themselves. Emily stared at the photos through tears she didn't remember shedding. She never told me she was proud. She never said. She didn't want you to know the sacrifice she'd made to ensure your future. She sold everything, Emily. Her house, her furniture, her jewelry, everything except this ring. She gave it all up to make sure you could finish nursing school without debt, without burden. The truth hit Emily like a physical blow. All these years she'd carried student loans, worked double shifts, struggled to make ends meet, never knowing that her grandmother had given up everything to try to secure her future. Marcus was backing toward the door, his face pale. This conversation is over. I'm calling hospital security. Security won't help you now, Richard said quietly. Because tomorrow morning I'm calling an emergency board meeting. And Emily Carter is going to tell them everything. Emily looked up at Richard Hamilton, this man who had held her grandmother's secrets for 3 months, who had worn her ring like a sacred trust. Why? She whispered. Why help me? Why risk your own family? Richard's smile was sad but genuine. Because Rosa Santos asked me to. and because some promises are more important than blood. In the distance, Emily could hear Marcus's voice in the hallway, angry and desperate as he spoke on his phone. But for the first time in 15 years, she wasn't afraid of powerful men making plans in rooms she couldn't enter. She was finally strong enough to know the truth. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp, autumn light that made everything seem possible. Emily stood in the hospital's executive conference room at 6 a.m., 2 hours before the emergency board meeting, surrounded by boxes of evidence that Richard's private investigator had compiled over 3 months. Sarah had arrived early to help, bringing coffee and the kind of steady support that only true friendship could provide. "Em, are you absolutely sure about this?" she asked, organizing witness statements into neat piles. "Once you walk into that boardroom, there's no going back." Emily slipped her grandmother's ring onto her finger for the first time. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting 15 years to come home. Grandma Rosa spent her whole life being silenced by people who thought she didn't matter. Today her voice gets heard. The ring seemed to pulse with warmth against her skin, connecting her to generations of Portuguese women who had survived wars, poverty and displacement with their dignity intact. She thought of her great-great-grandmother, who had walked across Spain with 3 children during the revolution. Of her great-grandmother, who had worked in textile mills to send money back to family. Of Rosa Santos, who had sacrificed everything so her granddaughter could have choices she'd never had. Richard entered the conference room, moving slowly but with purpose, his color much better than the night before. Behind him walked a distinguished woman in her 60s, with silver hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Emily, I'd like you to meet Catherine Walsh. She's been my attorney for 20 years, and more importantly, she specializes in real estate fraud and victim advocacy." Catherine shook Emily's hand with a firm grip. "Ms. Carter, I've reviewed all the evidence regarding your grandmother's case and the broader pattern of Hamilton Development's illegal practices. What was done to your family and your neighbors was unconscionable. Can we prove it?" Emily asked. "We can prove it, prosecute it, and make sure every affected family receives compensation," Catherine replied. "But I need to warn you, this won't be easy. Marcus has powerful friends, expensive lawyers, and no conscience about destroying anyone who gets in his way." Emily looked down at the ring, remembering her grandmother's voice. "Minha querida, the hardest battles are the ones most worth fighting." "I'm ready," she said. Richard smiled, and for the first time, Emily could see past his wealth and power to the man who had genuinely cared about an elderly Portuguese woman's stories. "There's something else you should know, Emily. Your grandmother didn't just give me the ring and these photos. She also gave me a letter." He handed her an envelope, yellowed with age, addressed in her grandmother's careful handwriting. "Para minha querida Emily, when she is strong enough to change the world." Emily's hands trembled as she opened it. The letter was written in Portuguese, but she could still remember enough to understand. "My dearest granddaughter, if you are reading this, then you have found your strength. I am sorry I could not tell you the truth while I lived, that your education was paid for not just with my house, but with my silence about the evil that stole it. I chose your future over my pride, and I would make the same choice again. You have the heart of your great-grandmother Teresa, who stood up to soldiers when they came for our neighbors. You have the spirit of your great-great-grandmother Maria, who saved her children by walking through a war. And you have something they never had, the education and opportunity to fight back. The ring will remind you that love is stronger than fear, and that sometimes the greatest victory is helping others find their voices. Make them listen, minha querida. Make them remember that we were here, that we mattered, that we loved this place enough to call it home. Com todo meu amor, vovó Rosa." Emily wiped tears from her cheeks as Sarah squeezed her shoulder. "What does it say?" "It says I come from a long line of women who fought for what was right, even when they were afraid." Emily folded the letter carefully. "And it says today is the day I honor that legacy." At 8 a.m. sharp, the hospital board members began filing into the conference room. Emily recognized most of them from newspaper photos: wealthy donors, retired doctors, business leaders who shaped policy from mahogany tables in rooms like this. They looked puzzled and slightly irritated at being called to an emergency meeting. Marcus arrived last, flanked by 2 expensive-looking lawyers. He'd clearly been up all night. His usually perfect appearance was disheveled, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion or stress. He avoided looking at Emily entirely, focusing instead on setting up his own stack of documents. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the hospital's chief administrator and board chair, called the meeting to order. "Richard, you requested this emergency session. The floor is yours." Richard stood slowly, his presence commanding despite his recent health scare. "Thank you all for coming. What I'm about to present will be disturbing, but it's information that this board and this hospital needs to address immediately." He nodded to Emily. "I'd like you to meet Emily Carter, one of our finest nurses. She's here today not just as an employee, but as the granddaughter of Rosa Santos, whose story represents a pattern of fraud and abuse that has been perpetrated under the Hamilton Development name." Murmurs rippled through the room. Emily felt every eye turned to her, some curious, some skeptical, some already dismissive. A year ago, she would have wilted under such scrutiny. Today, with her grandmother's ring warm against her finger, she stood straighter. "Emily," Richard said gently, "tell them about your grandmother." Emily looked around the table at faces that had never known poverty, never felt powerless, never watched someone they loved lose everything to legal manipulation. She thought about staying small, staying safe, staying invisible. Instead, she began to speak, her voice clear and strong. Rosa Santos was 73 years old when Hamilton Development destroyed her life. She had lived in the same house for 40 years, had paid her taxes faithfully, had contributed to her community in ways that can't be measured in dollars. And she was cheated, lied to, and manipulated by people who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle to profit. The room was completely silent now, the weight of truth filling the air like electricity before a storm. "But today isn't just about my grandmother," Emily continued. "Today is about 17 families who lost their homes to fraud. Today is about a pattern of abuse that this board unknowingly enabled. And today is about making sure it never happens again." Emily reached for the first evidence folder, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. The board members leaned forward, their earlier annoyance replaced by growing concern as she spread documents across the polished table. "This is the falsified tax assessment for 47 Cherry Street, my grandmother's house," Emily said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent months learning every detail. "The property taxes shown here were inflated by 400% through fabricated municipal fees that don't exist in city records." Dr. Morrison frowned as she examined the documents. "These look official." "They were designed to look official," Catherine Walsh interjected, standing to address the board. "Mr. Hamilton asked me to investigate these transactions after concerns were raised. What we found was systematic fraud involving forged city seals, bribed inspectors, and fabricated legal notices." Marcus finally spoke, his voice tight with controlled panic. "This is a witch hunt, orchestrated by a disgruntled employee and my father's failing health. These accusations are documented," Richard interrupted, his tone cutting through his son's protests like a blade. "Marcus, I've seen the bank records. I've read the witness statements. I know what you did." Emily pulled out a photograph of Cherry Street as it had been, small houses with well-tended gardens, children playing on sidewalks, elderly residents sitting on porches sharing stories in Portuguese, Spanish, and English. The image seemed to glow with warmth and life. "This was a community," she said, her voice soft but penetrating. "These weren't just properties to be acquired. They were homes where families had built lives, where children learned their grandparents' languages, where neighbors shared food during hard times." She placed another photo beside the first, the same street now, lined with glass towers and empty sidewalks. The contrast was stark, heartbreaking, and this is what it became. Luxury units that start at $5,000 a month, marketed to people who will never know that Mrs. Rodriguez grew the most beautiful roses on the East Coast in the garden that used to be where the parking garage stands now. Board member James Crawford, a man in his 70s who had grown up in the neighborhood, cleared his throat. "Emily, I remember Cherry Street. My family lived 6 blocks away. It was a good place." "It was," Emily agreed. "And the people who lived there deserved better than being lied to and cheated out of their homes." Catherine stepped forward, her professional demeanor commanding attention. "The evidence shows that Marcus Hamilton created a shell company to generate false tax liens, bribed city officials to fast-track eviction proceedings, and forged documents to make the acquisitions appear legal. The total theft amounts to $12.3 million in undervalued property and fabricated fees. The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Emily watched Marcus's face cycle through denial, anger, and finally, desperate calculation. Even if these allegations were true, Marcus said, his voice rising, the statute of limitations has expired. There's nothing anyone can do about past transactions. Actually, there is, Catherine smiled grimly. Fraud has no statute of limitations, especially when it involves ongoing criminal conspiracy. And since Hamilton Development is still profiting from these illegally acquired properties, the crimes are technically still in progress. Emily felt a surge of satisfaction as she watched Marcus realize his legal position was crumbling. But this wasn't about revenge, it was about justice for her grandmother and all the other families who had been silenced. There's more, Richard said quietly, pulling out another folder. Marcus didn't just target immigrant families and elderly residents. The fraud extended to the hospital's community outreach programs. Dr. Morrison's face went pale. What do you mean? Hamilton Development was contracted to build affordable housing for hospital employees. Nurses, orderlies, support staff who couldn't afford market-rate apartments near the medical center, Richard explained. The city provided $8 million in grants for this project. Emily realized where this was going, her stomach tightening. The housing was never built, Richard continued. Instead, Marcus used the grant money to finance the luxury developments, leaving hospital employees like Emily to struggle with hour-long commutes or unaffordable rent. The revelation hit Emily like a physical blow. She thought of all the nights she'd fallen asleep on hospital break-room couches because she couldn't afford both rent and transportation home. She thought of Sarah, who shared a studio apartment with 2 other nurses. She thought of countless colleagues who worked double shifts not by choice, but out of financial desperation. You stole from us twice, Emily said, her voice shaking with controlled fury. You took our neighbors' homes, and then you took the housing that was supposed to help us afford to live near the jobs that served this community. Marcus was on his feet now, his composed facade completely shattered. This is insane. I built valuable properties that improved the neighborhood's economic profile. I created jobs, increased tax revenue. You created homelessness, Emily shot back, standing to face him across the table. You separated families, destroyed communities, and lined your pockets with money that was supposed to help working people afford decent housing. Working people? Marcus laughed bitterly. You mean people like you? People who think they deserve to live in prime real estate just because they change bedpans and empty trash cans. The room went dead silent. Even Marcus's lawyers looked shocked at the naked contempt in his voice. Emily felt something shift inside her, not anger this time, but a crystalline clarity that cut through years of self-doubt and imposed limitations. She touched her grandmother's ring and spoke with the accumulated strength of generations. People like me keep this hospital running, while people like you count money in boardrooms. People like me hold dying patients' hands at 3 a.m. and fight to save lives on minimum budgets. People like me matter, Marcus. We've always mattered. And today, finally, someone is going to listen. Dr. Morrison was staring at Marcus with disgust. Is this truly how you view the people who make our mission possible? But Emily wasn't finished. She had 15 years of silence to break, and she was just getting started. Tomorrow morning, she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. This story is going to be on every news channel in the city. Not because I want fame or attention, but because there are 17 families who deserve to know that someone finally stood up for them. Richard smiled, pride evident in his expression. Emily, there's one more thing you should know. The board has the power to not only terminate Hamilton Development's contracts with the hospital, but also to recommend criminal prosecution to the district attorney. Emily looked around the table at faces that were no longer dismissive or skeptical, but determined. For the first time in her adult life, she felt the intoxicating power of being truly heard. The question now, she said quietly, there's what you're going to do about it. The silence that followed Emily's challenge stretched taut as a bowstring. Board members exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from shock to determination. Dr. Morrison was the first to speak, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades making life-and-death decisions. Marcus Hamilton, you are hereby suspended from all board activities pending a full investigation. She turned to the hospital's legal counsel. I want every contract between this institution and Hamilton Development reviewed immediately. Marcus slammed his hand on the table, his composure finally cracking completely. "You can't do this. I've donated millions to this hospital. I've served on this board for 8 years. You need me." "What we need," said Dr. Morrison coldly, "is integrity." Emily watched Marcus's face cycle through disbelief, rage, and finally, desperate calculation. She could almost see him mentally cataloging his connections, his leverage, his escape routes. But for the first time in his privileged life, the doors that had always opened for him were slamming shut. "This isn't over," Marcus snarled, gathering his papers. "I'll fight every accusation, every insinuation. I have resources you can't imagine. And we have the truth," Emily said quietly, "which, as it turns out, is more powerful than your resources." Marcus turned on her with venom in his eyes. "Don't think this makes you special, nurse. Don't think this changes who you are or where you come from. When this is over, you'll still be nobody." The words should have hurt. For 29 years, they would have sent Emily spiraling into self-doubt and shame. But with her grandmother's ring warm on her finger and the weight of justice finally shifting in her favor, Emily felt something different entirely. Pity. "You're right," she said calmly. "I am nobody special. I'm just a nurse from a Portuguese family who lost everything to men like you. But you know what I've learned? Being nobody special means I represent everybody. Every nurse working double shifts to pay rent. Every family forced from their homes by legal manipulation. Every person you've dismissed as unworthy of basic respect." Richard struggled to his feet, his face pale but his voice strong. "Marcus, you have 1 hour to clean out your office and surrender all hospital access credentials. Security will escort you from the building. You're my father." Marcus's voice cracked with something that might have been genuine emotion. "How can you do this to me?" Richard's expression softened for just a moment, grief flickering across his features. "Because your mother and I raised you to be better than this. Because Rosa Santos died believing that good people would eventually do the right thing. And because some mistakes are too big for love to fix." Marcus stared at his father for a long moment, then turned and stalked from the room, his lawyers trailing behind like expensive shadows. The door slammed with a finality that seemed to echo through the building. Emily sank back into her chair, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was fading, leaving her feeling hollow and strangely disconnected from her own triumph. Sarah, who had been quietly documenting everything, moved to stand behind Emily's chair. "You did it, Em. You actually did it." But Emily wasn't sure how to feel about it. Justice was messier than she'd imagined, less satisfying and more complicated. Marcus would face consequences, yes, but would that truly heal the damage he'd caused? Would it bring back her grandmother's garden, or restore the community that had been scattered to the winds? Dr. Morrison was speaking to the board about next steps: criminal referrals, victim compensation, policy changes to prevent future abuse. The conversation was necessary and important, but Emily found herself thinking about the 17 families who might never know that someone had finally stood up for them. "Emily," Richard said gently, interrupting her thoughts, "I know this feels overwhelming. Justice often does." She looked at him. This man who had worn her grandmother's ring for 3 months, who had carried the weight of someone else's secrets, who had chosen truth over family loyalty. "What happens now?" "Now the real work begins," Catherine Walsh said, settling into the chair Marcus had vacated. "We'll help every affected family file for compensation. We'll work with prosecutors to ensure criminal charges are filed. And we'll make sure this story is told in a way that honors your grandmother's memory." "But Marcus was right about one thing," Emily said quietly. "When all of this is over, I'll still be just a nurse. I'll still have student loans and a tiny apartment, and no real power to change anything else." Richard smiled, reaching over to pat her hand where her grandmother's ring caught the morning light. "Emily, do you know what your grandmother told me the night she gave me this ring?" Emily shook her head. She said, "Power isn't about money or position. Power is about choosing to speak when silence would be easier. You chose to speak today. That makes you one of the most powerful people I know." Dr. Morrison stood, addressing Emily directly. "Ms. Carter, the board has discussed offering you a position in our new patient advocacy program. It would involve investigating complaints, ensuring fair treatment, and serving as a liaison between hospital administration and staff." "Interested?" Emily's breath caught. "Are you offering me a job because you feel guilty about what happened?" "I'm offering you a job because you've demonstrated the exact qualities we need in that role," Dr. Morrison replied. "Courage, integrity, and the ability to see injustice clearly enough to fight it." Emily looked around the room at faces that had been skeptical an hour ago and were now looking at her with something approaching respect. She thought of her grandmother, who had cleaned houses and taken care of other people's children, while dreaming of a granddaughter who might have choices she'd never had. "I accept," Emily said, her voice steady. "But I have one condition." "Name it." "The Cherry Street families, all 17 of them, they get contacted personally about the compensation program. Not legal notices or form letters. Someone sits down with each family and explains what happened, what they're entitled to, and how we're going to make it right." Richard nodded approvingly. "I'll handle that personally." "It's the least I can do." Emily touched her grandmother's ring and felt for the first time in 15 years that she might actually have the power to keep more families from experiencing what hers had endured. The real work was just beginning. 3 weeks later, Emily stood in the same hospital conference room, but everything had changed. Sunlight streamed through windows that had witnessed so much pain and revelation, and the mahogany table was now surrounded by faces she'd never expected to see again. Maria Rodriguez, now 78, sat carefully in the chair closest to the window, her weathered hands folded over a manila envelope, thick with compensation documents. Her son, Carlos, translated quietly as Catherine Walsh explained the settlement terms. Mrs. Rodriguez had been Rosa Santos's closest neighbor, the woman who had shared coffee every morning and worried when Rosa stopped tending her roses. "She wants to know," Carlos said, his voice thick with emotion. "If this means she can finally stop feeling ashamed." Emily leaned forward, her new patient advocacy coordinator badge catching the light. "Tell her that she was never the one who should have felt ashamed. Tell her that what happened to her family, to all our families, was theft, and thieves are the ones who should carry shame, not their victims." As Carlos translated, Emily watched Mrs. Rodriguez's face transform. The hunched shoulders straightened slightly, the defensive posture softened. It was a small change, but Emily had learned that justice often happened in these quiet moments of restored dignity. Richard sat at the head of the table, looking older, but somehow more at peace than when Emily had first met him. Over the past 3 weeks, he had personally visited each of the 17 families, armed with documentation, apologies and settlement, checks that wouldn't restore what they'd lost but might ease what they'd endured. The Fernandez family has decided to use their settlement to open a community center in their new neighborhood, he reported, consulting his notes. They want to call it the Cherry Street Memorial Center, to honor all the families who lost their homes. Emily felt tears prick her eyes. The Fernandez family had been forced from a house where they'd raised 4 children and hosted countless community gatherings. That they would use their compensation to create new spaces for community showed a generosity that humbled her. Dr. Morrison entered the room carrying a newspaper, her expression grim. "I thought you should all see this morning's edition." The headline read, "Former hospital board member, indicted on 47 counts of real estate fraud." Below was a photograph of Marcus Hamilton being led from a courthouse in handcuffs, his expensive lawyers flanking him like guards who could no longer protect him from consequences. The district attorney says it's one of the largest housing fraud cases in the city's history. Dr. Morrison continued. Marcus is facing up to 15 years in federal prison. Emily felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that justice was being served, sadness for Richard, who had lost his son to greed and arrogance, and something that might have been closure, though she was learning that healing was more complicated than punishment. Emily, Mrs. Rodriguez spoke directly to her in heavily accented but clear English. "Your grandmother, she would be proud." "Thank you," Emily whispered, touching the ring that had become her daily reminder of strength inherited and justice deferred, but not denied. Sarah appeared in the doorway, still in her nursing scrubs from the morning shift. There's someone here to see you." "Says it's about Cherry Street." A young woman about Emily's age entered hesitantly, clutching a small girl's hand. The child, maybe 6 years old, had dark curls and curious eyes that reminded Emily powerfully of her younger self. "I'm Ana Santos Chen," the woman said, her voice nervous. "Rosa Santos was my great-aunt." This is my daughter, Isabella. Emily's heart stopped. Santos Chen? My grandmother was Rosa's niece. She moved to California before everything happened with the houses. But she kept in touch with Tia Rosa, and she told me about you, about the ring. Anna's eyes went to Emily's hand where her grandmother's ring caught the afternoon light. Tia Rosa wrote to my grandmother before she died. She said the ring was going to someone who would fight for the family, someone who would make sure we weren't forgotten. Isabella tugged on her mother's hand and whispered something in Portuguese. Anna smiled, her nervousness fading slightly. She wants to know if you're the prima Emily who made the bad man go to jail. Emily knelt down to Isabella's eye level, her heart full of an emotion she couldn't name. I'm Emily, and your family. Isabella has been learning Portuguese from my grandmother, Anna explained. When she heard about what you did, she insisted we had to come meet you. She's been practicing something she wants to say. The little girl stepped forward, her voice clear and proud as she spoke in careful Portuguese. Obrigada por lutar pela nossa família. Thank you for fighting for our family. Emily felt the tears she'd been holding back for weeks finally flow freely. She thought of her grandmother, who had died believing she was alone, never knowing that her great niece in California was teaching Portuguese lullabies to another generation, never knowing that the family she'd fought to protect was still growing, still connected by love and language, and the courage to stand up for what was right. We want to do something to honor Tia Rosa and all the families, Anna continued. Isabella and I are starting a scholarship fund for nursing students from immigrant families. We are calling it the Rosa Santos Memorial Scholarship for Future Advocates. Richard looked up from his notes, interest sparking in his eyes. How can we help? The Hamilton Foundation will provide matching funds, he said immediately. It's the least we can do to ensure Rosa's legacy lives on in young people who will fight for others, the way Emily fought for her memory. Emily stood, her mind racing with possibilities. A scholarship program, a community center, criminal prosecutions that would deter future fraud, media coverage that had already inspired other victims to come forward with their own stories. Her grandmother's sacrifice was creating ripples that would touch lives she'd never even imagined. There's something else, Emily said, an idea forming. What if we created a legal clinic? Free representation for families facing housing fraud, predatory lending, illegal evictions. We could call it the Cherry Street Justice Project. Catherine Walsh smiled approvingly. I'd be honored to help organize it. As Emily looked around the room, at faces that had found hope again, at a man who had chosen justice over family loyalty, at a little girl who spoke the language of her ancestors with pride, she realized that her grandmother had been right about power. It wasn't about money or position. It was about choosing to speak when silence would be easier. And the most powerful thing of all was making sure other people found their voices too. 1 year later, Emily stood in the garden behind the Cherry Street Memorial Community Center, watching Isabella Santos Chen teach a group of children how to plant roses in soil that had once held her grandmother's house. The morning sun painted everything golden, and the air was sweet with the promise of blooms to come. Around them, the sounds of construction mixed with laughter as contractors worked to complete the center's final wing, a legal clinic that would offer free representation to families facing housing fraud. Prima Emily, Isabella called out, her Portuguese now fluent and confident. Look, the roses are growing. Emily knelt beside the small garden plot, admiring the tender green shoots that pushed through the earth with determined optimism. Your Tia Rosa would have loved this, she said, touching the soil where her grandmother's garden had once flourished. She always said roses were the most hopeful flowers. They bloom even after the worst winters. Richard approached from the community center, moving slowly but steadily. His health had improved dramatically since Marcus's conviction, as if exposing the truth had lifted a weight he'd carried for years. He now served as the chairman of the Cherry Street Justice Project, dedicating his remaining years to undoing the damage his son had caused. The scholarship recipients are here for the ceremony, he said, his voice warm with pride. 12 nursing students from immigrant families, all committed to advocacy and community health. Emily smiled, thinking of the young women and men who would carry forward the mission her grandmother had started, simply by refusing to let injustice have the final word. The Rosa Santos Memorial Scholarship had already funded students from El Salvador, Somalia, Bangladesh, and the Philippines, all people whose families had faced challenges similar to what the Cherry Street community had endured. Ana Santos Chen emerged from the community center, carrying a microphone and a folder full of speaking notes. Over the past year, she had become the project's public face, traveling to conferences and community meetings to share their story and help other neighborhoods organize against housing fraud. "Emily, they're ready for you," she said, then paused. "Are you nervous?" Emily touched her grandmother's ring, which had become her daily reminder that courage was a choice, not a feeling. Always. But Grandma Rosa didn't let fear stop her from protecting her family. "I won't let it stop me from protecting others." The ceremony was being held in the center's main hall, a bright, airy space with walls covered in photographs and stories from the original Cherry Street community. Mrs. Rodriguez had contributed pictures from neighborhood festivals, baptisms, and block parties that showed the life that had flourished here before Marcus Hamilton's greed destroyed it. But the photos weren't monuments to loss. They were reminders of the community that could be rebuilt, stronger and more intentional than before. Emily walked to the podium, looking out at faces that represented hope made manifest. The 12 scholarship recipients sat in the front row, their families surrounding them with pride that radiated like warmth. Behind them were representatives from housing advocacy groups, legal aid organizations, and immigrant rights coalitions who had joined the movement that began with one nurse's refusal to stay silent. Catherine Walsh sat with other attorneys who now volunteered at the legal clinic, providing free representation to families facing eviction or fraud. Sarah Chen had taken a position as the center's health coordinator, bringing medical services to a community that had been underserved for too long. And in the back, barely visible but impossible to ignore, were news cameras and reporters who had followed this story from its explosive beginning to its transformative continuation. Emily had learned to work with the media without being consumed by it, understanding that publicity was a tool for justice, not an end in itself. "A year ago," Emily began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall, "I thought power was something other people had. People with money, with connections, with impressive titles and expensive suits. I thought my voice didn't matter because I was just a nurse, just a granddaughter of immigrants, just someone who cleaned up after other people's messes." She paused, letting her eyes move across the audience, seeing nods of recognition from people who had felt the same powerlessness. "But I learned that the most dangerous thing in the world is someone who has nothing left to lose except their silence. When my grandmother died, she left me this ring." Emily held up her hand, letting the antique gold catch the light, "and the understanding that love is stronger than fear, truth is stronger than money, and community is stronger than any individual who tries to destroy it." Applause rippled through the hall, but Emily wasn't finished. The Cherry Street that existed before was beautiful, but it was also vulnerable. The families who lived there trusted that the system would protect them, that following the rules would keep them safe. They learned painfully that systems are only as strong as the people who are willing to fight for them. She gestured to the scholarship recipients. "These young people represent the future we're building together. They're going into nursing, social work, law, and community organizing with the understanding that their job isn't just to care for individuals, it's to care for the systems that determine whether communities thrive or merely survive." Isabella Santos Chen had been listening intently, and now she stood up in her chair, raising her small hand. "Prima Emily, will you teach me to fight bad people too?" Laughter rippled through the audience, but Emily's response was serious. "I'll teach you something better, Mina querida. I'll teach you to build good things that are stronger than the bad things people try to create." As the ceremony continued, with scholarship presentations and community recognition awards, Emily felt her grandmother's presence like a gentle hand on her shoulder. Rosa Santos had died believing she was alone, but her sacrifice had created something she never could have imagined, a movement that turned individual loss into collective power. The ring on Emily's finger wasn't just jewelry, it was a promise carried forward, a reminder that love persistent enough to survive war and poverty and injustice could also be strong enough to transform the world. After the ceremony, as Emily walked through the memorial garden, where roses grew in soil that remembered better days, she thought about the question that had haunted her for 15 years. Why had her grandmother stayed silent? Now she understood. Rosa Santos hadn't stayed silent. She had spoken the most powerful words possible. She had raised a granddaughter who would refuse to let injustice have the final word. And in the laughter of children learning to tend roses, in the determined voices of young advocates planning their futures, in the quiet satisfaction of families who had found justice at last, Emily heard her grandmother's voice echoing through time. My dearest Emily, you were always strong enough to change the world. Sometimes the smallest things, a ring, a conversation, a moment of courage, can change everything. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to remember their own strength. Have you ever found the courage to speak up when silence would have been easier? Tell us your story in the comments below. And if you know someone who feels invisible, who thinks their voice doesn't matter, send them this story. Remind them that every movement for justice begins with one person deciding they've had enough of being quiet. The most powerful thing we can do is help each other find our voices. Because when we speak together, we can move mountains. Or at least we can make sure that no grandmother ever again has to choose between her home and her granddaughter's future. What will you choose to fight for?